When did pain stop being something you recover from and start becoming something you weaponize? Today, you don't win arguments by being right. You win by being hurt louder, faster, and more convincingly than anyone else in the room. Evidence can be ignored, context can be dismissed. But the moment someone claims emotional damage, the conversation is over. Questioning them isn't debate anymore, it's violence. We call this empathy. We call it progress. But notice what's really happening. Pain has become a credential, a moral fast pass, a way to shut down disagreement without ever engaging it. And the internet doesn't just allow this, it rewards it. Outrage spreads. Sympathy piles up. Power shifts instantly to whoever frames themselves as the most wounded. Stay till the end. Because once you see how victimhood quietly turned into one of the most effective weapons online used to silence, control, and dominate, you'll start questioning how many empathy debates were never about healing at all. They were about winning. The surface image of this culture looks compassionate, gentle even. Language softens, tone lowers. Everyone speaks carefully about holding space, listening, and validating lived experience. On the outside, it feels like progress, a long overdue correction to decades of dismissal and cruelty. But watch how these conversations actually unfold. An argument begins the way arguments always have. A disagreement, a clash of ideas, two perspectives colliding in public. Then suddenly the rules change. One side doesn't respond with evidence or reasoning, but with injury. This harmed me. This made me feel unsafe. This triggered my trauma. And the moment those words land, the entire dynamic shifts. The topic doesn't matter anymore. The facts don't matter. The intent doesn't matter. What matters is that pain has been claimed publicly, visibly, and in a way that the internet recognizes as legitimate. From that moment on, disagreement becomes taboo. Anyone who continues to question, clarify, or push back is no longer debating ideas. They're invalidating someone's experience. They're punching down. They're re-traumatizing. The moral frame locks in instantly, and once it does, there's no clean way out. Silence looks respectful. Speech looks cruel. This is the surface illusion that these moments are about care. Scroll through comment sections and you'll see the same pattern repeat. Support floods in. I'm so sorry you went through that. Thank you for being brave. Your feelings are valid. None of this is wrong on its own. Empathy matters. Listening matters. But notice what's missing: curiosity, inquiry, any attempt to understand what actually happened beyond the emotional claim. Pain becomes self-authenticating. No one asks follow-up questions because questions imply doubt, and doubt is treated as hostility. The safest move is affirmation, not because it's always true, but because it's socially rewarded. The algorithm amplifies it. The crowd approves it. Moral alignment is signaled with a few supportive words and a well-placed emoji. Meanwhile, the original issue disappears entirely. What started as a discussion about ideas, behavior, or consequences quietly transforms into a referendum on character. One person is positioned as wounded. The other, by default, becomes dangerous. The roles solidify quickly, often within minutes, and once those roles are assigned, reversing them is nearly impossible. This is where the surface image becomes deceptive. We tell ourselves this culture protects the vulnerable, but in practice it often protects the most rhetorically effective, the people who know how to frame discomfort as harm, who understand the language that triggers collective defense, who can escalate emotional stakes faster than anyone else in the room. And the internet learns from this. People observe which posts gain sympathy, which stories go viral, which claims shut down opposition instantly. Over time, a playbook forms. Pain is foregrounded, complexity is stripped away, everything is narrated through the lens of personal damage because damage commands attention. This doesn't mean the pain is fake. That's the uncomfortable part. Most of the time it's real, but real pain doesn't automatically make someone right, and online, that distinction collapses. Emotional truth replaces factual truth. Lived experience replaces shared reality. And once that happens, Disagreement becomes impossible, because how do you debate a feeling without being framed as cruel? How do you challenge a narrative without being accused of harm? The surface culture tells you the answer clearly: you don't. You step back, you apologize, or you disappear. This is why so many conversations online feel frozen, brittle, and tense. Everyone is hyper-aware that the wrong response could instantly reposition them as the villain. So people adapt, they soften language, they hedge opinions, they avoid topics entirely, not because they lack thoughts, but because the cost of speaking feels unpredictable. What looks like empathy on the surface often functions as deterrence underneath. And once you notice that, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore: the mythology that keeps this system morally untouchable. At some point, the internet decided that pain wasn't just something you survived, it was something that proved who you were. And from that moment on, a mythology began to form. In this myth, suffering isn't contextual, it isn't complicated, it isn't one part of a larger story. It's a credential, a moral passport that grants immediate authority. If you've been hurt, you don't just deserve care, you deserve control over the narrative. This is where victimhood stops being descriptive and starts being performative. The stories follow a familiar structure, a personal account framed carefully. The language is precise, emotionally legible, and optimized for recognition. Words like unsafe, triggered, harmful, and trauma appear early, not to explain, but to establish stakes. Once those words are present, the audience knows exactly how to respond. Support first, questions later, if at all. The mythology insists that lived experience is unchallengeable, not just important, untouchable. The moment someone says, "This hurt me," the story becomes sealed. Asking for details sounds like interrogation. Asking for evidence sounds like cruelty. Asking for proportionality sounds like denial. And the crowd learns quickly. You can see it in comment sections, stitched videos, reaction posts. People don't ask what happened. They ask how fast they can align. Sympathy becomes a reflex. Nuance becomes a liability. The safest moral position is immediate validation regardless of what's actually being claimed. This is how pain becomes self-authenticating. No corroboration required, no contradiction allowed. The emotional claim is treated as the final word, and once it's accepted publicly, it hardens into identity. The person isn't someone who experienced harm, they are the harm survivor, full stop. Everything they say afterward carries that authority forward. Here's the part that rarely gets questioned. This mythology doesn't just elevate the hurt, it simplifies them. It freezes them in the moment of injury and turns that moment into a permanent role. Complexity disappears, contradictions vanish, growth becomes irrelevant. The narrative only works if the wound stays open, because closed wounds don't generate power. Over time, this creates an unspoken hierarchy. Not all pain is equal. Some stories travel faster. Some language signals legitimacy more effectively. Those who master the vocabulary of harm gain influence not because they're lying, but because they know how the system listens. And the system listens selectively. It rewards stories that are clear, emotionally charged, and morally unambiguous. It struggles with messier realities, shared responsibility, misunderstanding, mutual harm. Those don't fit the myth. They don't generate outrage. They don't offer a clean villain. So the myth narrows. Pain becomes proof, discomfort becomes danger, disagreement becomes violence. The vocabulary stretches until it no longer describes reality, it replaces it. Emotional impact stands in for causality. Feeling harmed becomes equivalent to being wronged. And once that equivalence is accepted, the mythology protects itself. Anyone who challenges it isn't just wrong, they're suspect. Their motives are questioned, their character reframed. Their skepticism turned into evidence. Why are you defending this becomes the only response. The content of the argument dissolves completely. This is how moral authority detaches from truth. The mythology tells us this is about empathy, about finally listening, about centering voices that were ignored, and there's truth in that at first. But the myth doesn't stop where empathy ends. It keeps going quietly, converting care into control. Because when pain grants immunity, it also grants leverage. Not everyone who enters this system intends to exploit it. Most don't. But the incentives don't require intent. They only require repetition. Stories that shut down opposition spread faster. Language that triggers defense goes further. Over time, people adapt. They learn what works. And once adaptation begins, sincerity and strategy blur. Pain doesn't have to be invented to be instrumentalized. It only has to be framed correctly. The mythology takes care of the rest. The crowd enforces it, the algorithm amplifies it, and the conversation becomes less about what happened and more about who gets to speak next. This is the illusion at the center of the myth. It claims to protect the vulnerable while quietly rewarding the most rhetorically skilled. It claims to value healing while structuring conflict so it never resolves. It claims to reject power while redistributing it through emotional dominance. And once pain becomes power, the original purpose understanding quietly disappears. What remains is a culture where being hurt matters more than being honest, where narratives outweigh reality, and where the most important question is no longer what's true, it's who gets to be untouchable. Once pain becomes authority, the system no longer needs truth to function. It only needs escalation. What looks like empathy on the surface begins to operate like leverage underneath, because if being hurt grants moral immunity, then the fastest way to gain power in a conflict isn't to clarify what happened, it's to amplify how much it hurt. And the internet is perfectly designed for that amplification. This is where the incentives quietly reveal themselves. Platforms don't reward resolution, they reward engagement. They reward intensity, repetition, and moral certainty. A calm explanation dies in the feed. A measured response sinks. But a post framed around harm, especially personal harm, spreads. It invites defense. It invites outrage. It invites sides. So the system trains behavior. People learn that pain once declared must be defended at all costs. Walking it back looks like weakness. Complicating it looks like betrayal. Even acknowledging misunderstanding can feel dangerous because it risks losing the authority that pain confers. The narrative must stay intact. This is how conflicts become permanent. Traditional accountability aims for closure. Something happened, it's addressed, repair occurs, and the relationship moves forward or ends. But in this system, closure undermines power. If the wound heals, the leverage disappears. So the structure subtly discourages healing and rewards continuation. Anger stays useful, hurt stays visible, and the crowd plays its role without realizing it. Online defending someone who claims harm feels righteous. It feels like standing up for the vulnerable. But defense quickly turns into enforcement. Anyone who questions the narrative isn't just disagreeing, they're threatening the moral order. The response becomes swift and absolute: shut it down, call it out, remove it. This is where fear enters the conversation. People watching these cycles learn what happens to those who ask the wrong questions. They see how quickly skepticism is reframed as cruelty, how curiosity is treated as hostility, how neutrality is interpreted as complicity, and they adjust accordingly. Silence becomes safety, not because people lack opinions, but because the cost of being misinterpreted is too high. A poorly worded sentence can trigger accusations. A clumsy question can escalate into character assassination, so people retreat into pre-approved language or say nothing at all. This creates a chilling effect that the system never acknowledges. On the surface, the culture claims to encourage speaking out. In practice, it only rewards speaking in very specific ways. You can share pain, but not doubt. You can narrate injury, but not ambiguity. You can condemn, but you cannot examine. The result is moral compression. Complex situations are flattened into simple binaries. Someone is hurt. Someone caused it. One deserves protection. The other deserves removal. Proportionality disappears, intent becomes irrelevant, context becomes suspect. And here's the most uncomfortable part. This structure doesn't just empower the vulnerable, it empowers the most rhetorically skilled. Those who know how to frame experiences in the language the system recognizes gain influence not because they're lying, but because the system only listens to certain signals. Pain expressed quietly is ignored. Pain expressed loudly is rewarded. Over time, this creates competition. Whose pain is worse? whose story deserves more attention, whose harm justifies the strongest response. The system doesn't ask these questions explicitly, but it answers them implicitly through visibility, and visibility becomes validation. This is where sincerity and strategy begin to blur. People don't need to fake trauma to benefit from this system. They only need to present real experiences in ways that maximize moral protection. The incentives take care of the rest. Stories get sharper. Language gets stronger. Boundaries expand. What once felt uncomfortable becomes unsafe. What once felt wrong becomes violent. And once the vocabulary stretches that far, everything becomes punishable. Disagreement isn't just disagreement anymore, it's harm. Confusion isn't confusion, it's invalidation. Even silence can be reframed as aggression. The moral net widens until almost anyone can be caught in it. This is why the system feels both fragile and aggressive at the same time. It can't tolerate questioning because questioning threatens the hierarchy it created. If pain can be examined, it can be contextualized. If it can be contextualized, it can be proportioned. And if it can be proportioned, it loses its absolute authority. So the system protects itself. It moralizes language, it weaponizes tone, it turns emotional reaction into evidence, and it teaches everyone involved that the safest position is alignment, not understanding. But alignment doesn't build trust, it builds compliance, and compliance is easier to enforce than truth. The final irony is this: a culture that claims to center healing increasingly produces exhaustion, resentment, and fear. People don't feel safer speaking, they feel watched, measured, one misstep away from being reframed as the villain. That's not empathy at scale, that's control through emotion. And once control becomes the function of pain, the question isn't whether the system helps the wounded, it's whether it can tell the difference between care and coercion at all. Zoom out, and this isn't just an internet problem, it's a social retraining. What we're watching happen online is the normalization of emotional hierarchy, the idea that some voices deserve automatic protection while others deserve automatic suspicion, not because of what they've done, but because of how their feelings are framed. Over time, that logic doesn't stay confined to comment sections. It leaks outward. Into workplaces, into classrooms, into friendships. People begin to navigate conversations not by asking what is true, but by calculating what is safe to say. Language becomes defensive. Disagreement becomes risky. Even curiosity feels dangerous when it can be reframed as harm. This is how dialogue slowly disappears. In theory, a culture that values empathy should create more understanding. In practice, when empathy is enforced rather than chosen, it becomes performative. People learn the correct responses. They memorize the approved phrases. They signal alignment without necessarily believing or understanding anything. What looks like care starts functioning like compliance, and compliance has consequences. Work environments grow tense. Teams avoid hard conversations. Feedback gets diluted into vague reassurance. Problems don't disappear, they go underground. Conflict isn't resolved, it's deferred until it explodes somewhere less controllable. The same pattern plays out socially. Friend groups fracture quietly. People stop being honest with each other. They curate versions of themselves depending on the room they're in. One wrong sentence can redefine an entire relationship. So people choose restraint over connection, silence over risk. The irony is sharp. A culture that claims to amplify marginalized voices often ends up privileging the most emotionally fluent. Those who can articulate harm in the language the system recognizes gain influence. Those who feel deeply but speak awkwardly are left exposed. Emotional intelligence becomes less important than emotional presentation. This also reshapes how responsibility is understood. When harm is defined primarily by how something feels, accountability becomes unworkable. There's no shared standard to negotiate against. If impact is entirely subjective, then intent, context, and proportionality lose meaning. Resolution becomes impossible because there's no agreed endpoint. Everything stays open-ended, raw, unfinished, and that unfinished state benefits the system. Ongoing tension drives engagement, lingering outrage keeps people invested, closure doesn't trend, ambiguity doesn't go viral. So the culture quietly rewards staying hurt over getting better. This is why so many online conflicts feel endless. They're not designed to conclude, they're designed to position. Who is protected? Who is questioned? Who is allowed to speak without consequences? And who must constantly justify their presence? What's being lost isn't empathy, it's trust. Trust that disagreement isn't violence. Trust that misunderstanding isn't malice. Trust that people can be imperfect without being dangerous. Without that trust, every conversation becomes a potential battlefield. Every interaction carries risk. And society doesn't become kinder, it becomes brittle. The question isn't whether pain should be taken seriously. It's whether a culture that turns pain into power can still tell the difference between healing and control. In the end, the most dangerous thing about this culture isn't that people talk about pain. It's that pain has stopped being something we try to understand and started being something we're afraid to question. Somewhere along the way, empathy turned into a rule book, one that tells you when to speak, when to stay silent, and when to disappear entirely. Not because you caused harm, but because someone framed harm convincingly enough that disagreement became socially lethal. This culture doesn't ask for reflection. It asks for submission, and submission looks like kindness on the surface, soft words, careful tones, immediate validation, but underneath it trains everyone to avoid complexity, to fear nuance, to equate honesty with cruelty. So people adapt. They stop asking questions, they stop challenging narratives, they stop trusting their own judgment, not because they lack empathy, but because empathy has been weaponized against them. The tragedy is that this doesn't protect the vulnerable in the long run. It creates a system where only certain kinds of pain are legible, only certain voices are safe, and only certain stories are allowed to exist without interrogation. Everyone else learns to perform or disappear. If pain grants power, then power will always find pain. Not to heal it, but to use it. And once that happens, the original purpose of empathy is lost entirely. Because empathy that cannot be examined isn't compassion, it's control. The question we're left with isn't whether we should listen to people who are hurting. It's whether a society that treats pain as unquestionable authority can still tell the difference between care and coercion. And if it can't, then silence will always feel safer than truth.